Great to see you all. Thank you for coming to the Freud Museum, the former home of Sigmund Freud and Anna Freud, to the conference Rebuilding Aleppo, Memory, Loss and Creation. The conference is organized by the Foundation for Art and Psychoanalysis, and this is the Foundation's first event in Britain. The Foundation was founded back in 2013 by Camille Germanos, who is here today with us, who is Lebanese, and she set the foundation in response to the failure of the Arab Revolution. My name is FREUD and I'm the art director of the foundation. I could not resist reading a very short extract from this admiring 7th century Chinese text quoted in this wonderful book by Timothy Power, Byzantium, Red Sea, Byzantium to Caliphate, AD 500 to 1000. Syria, the Chinese author wrote, was a place that produces fire luster cloth, life-restoring incense, bright moon pearls, and night luster germs. Brigands and robbers are unknown, but the people enjoy happiness and peace. None but illustrious laws prevail, none but virtues are raised to sovereign power. The land is broad and ample, and its literary productions are perspicuous and clear. We will have today artists, composers, art historians, musicologists, psychoanalysts, movie makers, curators, architects, designers, linguists, colleagues from the Tate Gallery, British Museum, Victoria and Albert Museum, British Council, Icon Gallery, Birmingham, Arab British Centre, Cast Cornwall, to talk about Syria, about this tragic conflict that's been lasting now for 7 years, with almost 500,000 dead. But I think, and hopefully we will not be talking about politics, but how art and creativity could bring people together. I'll pass it to our chair for today, Vicky Richardson. Vicky is independent curator and writer, and she's Associate Director of the London School of Architecture. Previously, she was the Director of Architecture, Design and Fashion at British Council, and she was editor of influential design magazine Blueprint. So I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, FREUD. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Camille, really, and FREUD for organising today. It was really their idea, and I'm really glad to be part of it. Very flattered to be invited to chair this event. We should, in the spirit of Freud, we should treat today's event as a sort of a free and a safe space where we can all speak about the subject, even if we haven't been to Syria, even if we haven't even been to the region. I think that we have many people amongst us today who are Syrians and know the region and Aleppo intimately. But the idea is to have an equal shared conversation. The important question, I suppose, or one important question, is when does reconstruction actually begin? Because, of course, the situation in Syria makes reconstruction very, very difficult at this moment. But I think that, in a way, reconstruction begins the moment that destruction takes place, in certain ways. And the workings of the mind, the imagination in particular, are so key in beginning that process. And today is all about an exchange of ideas, and so the format is going to be very much based on conversation, and I hope lots of opportunity for the audience to share their thoughts as well. But we have an amazing lineup of guests and speakers today. So we're going to begin with a film screening, and that will be followed by a conversation between Tuna and Richard Wentworth. So, hello. Isa, can you see us?
Yes, I can see everybody.
Good. Hi. Isa Tuma is a self-taught photographer and film director based in Aleppo, but actually currently in Stockholm, I believe. His work can be found in lots of international collections around the world, including the V&A and the FOMO Museum in Antwerp. Recently, his latest movie, Greetings from Aleppo, opened the International Film Festival of Rotterdam last year and has won several awards. Isa, if you're able to hear me, could you possibly tell us about art camping and start off this conversation by just telling us some context for the film and what you were trying to do with that film?
Capture of the City is very special for me because it was now after Aleppo United, we find out that some of the texture we did, the area is disappeared completely. I helped a student and we start to take the textures of everything within that can be lost. After a few weeks, that area turned into war zone, and we couldn't check if the place where we work is still complete or not.
Could you explain a bit more about what inspired the rubbings and that particular activity? Because it's in a way easy to read history backwards. We know what happened following the film being made, but at the time you can't have known what was going to happen, and so it seems even more amazing that you had this idea to record the city in this particular way. But I wondered what was in your mind at the time when you came up with this idea of making the rubbings and getting people involved in doing that.
People was really shocked in the street because they didn't know why we're doing that. They didn't care even, because even when we enter some shops, people, they didn't think, they didn't stop us, they didn't ask questions, They say, okay, do it. It's kind between the people have like hopeless and worry from the future. So he didn't protect his stuff from us.
Right, it's Richard Wentworth, who is a renowned British artist, and since the 70s has been particularly interested in capturing chance encounters and urban life, and has been working on an ongoing series called Making Do and Getting By since 1974. And Richard's interest is in materials and found elements, and the sort of coincidences of urban life.
To make a rubbing is probably the oldest thing in the world to transfer something. It's completely standard craft process. To me, watching it innocently, I was incredibly moved by its simplicity. And it's much easier to press a piece of paper on something and go into a store and say, have you got something this size, than to start measuring. So there's something fantastic linguistically about it. And then, exactly as you said, there's this other thing, which is that children do it. So everybody becomes a child. I mean, because the context is a little, as you've already said, going into a shop or... all you can do in those situations is to just use your manners. You have to tell them you're not going to rob them and tease them a little bit, which children do, and you probably, as an artist, get away with it. But I think Vicky's point is your prescience, which is very typical, I think, in artists, that people say, oh, artists see the future. Artists are far too stupid to see the future, but they do things which are constantly future-facing. So there's something in what you've done that is, the last word I wrote down was tenderness. And there's something about the way that you said, we're alive. So that's a self-affirming thing. I walk in here and the first thing I see is that Mr. Freud's keys have made marks on his cupboard because they've spent 100 years on the planet, and that's what keys do to timber. And no one ever expects that. It's the cabinet maker probably rather hopes it's not going to happen, but actually it makes that cupboard. These two little marks of somebody was there, and all that work is speaking of that to me.
Our next session has a slightly unwieldy title of The Women, the Other, Art and Psychoanalysis. Ola Abdallah is an artist born in Aleppo in 1978, and she spent her childhood in Paris, where she lives now, but then moved back to Syria to study at the Fine Arts Faculty of Damascus in 1996.
So first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me at this wonderful talk, which gives some hope to Syrians and to humanity in general. Rebuilding Aleppo for me now seems like a dream that will never come true, but I agree we must think about it and dream about it. Somehow it is already happening. People who struggled inside Aleppo has already begun to do it. For people outside, it's another story. Will it be possible for us to come back and to rebuild something? This is the question. I hate to say that, but war has some advantage. The revolution and the changing bring something like freedom of speech that didn't exist before, because you couldn't speak about anything. I mean, everything was forbidden. So now something happened, and this is great. Yes, there is lots of pain and lots of trauma, but there is something new happening, and this is what you're describing in your own family, and this is happening in all Syrian families. You have also political debate inside one family. This could never exist before. So yes, something new is happening, and it's going to be, I hope, better.
Buria Abdelouad, is that right?
Abdelouad.
Buria is a lecturer at the University of Paris Diderot. She's a psychoanalyst, research director and a translator. And she's translated many volumes of Arabic poetry into French. And she's also published her own work, Figures du Féminin en Islam, in 2012, which has been reprinted, and Les Femmes du Prophète in 2016, which is her most recent work. Speak in French slowly and short sentence, then Ola can translate. Yeah. No.
Et puis, comme j'ai beaucoup de réfugiés syriens en thérapie,
as I have a lot of Syrian refugees in therapy,
donc à ce moment-là, je me suis rendu compte de l'importance de la langue.
At this moment, I realized how much the language is important.
La langue et non pas la religion.
The language and not the religion.
Oui, parce que j'ai des chrétiens syriens.
Because I have Christian, Muslims.
Lorsque j'ai vu ces camions,
I wrote the book Woman of Prophet when I saw the camion.
Lorry.
Yeah, lorry, yeah.
Oui, pleine de femmes
full of
qui vont
women
être vendues par Daesh.
who are going to be sold by Daesh.
Et dans le monde arabe et musulman, il n'y avait aucune réaction.
And there were no kind of reaction in the Arabic Muslim world.
Et j'étais vraiment en révolte. Donc,
And I was really angry about this non-reaction.
il y a toujours eu des viols en temps de guerre. Toujours.
There were always rape in wartime.
And il y a toujours eu la famine. Mais avec Daesh, on ne parle que de Daesh, sur les djihadistes, etc.
But with Daesh and the jihadists,
il y avait une légitimité, entre guillemets, religieuse.
They gave a religious legitimacy to them.
Donc, il y a, en temps de guerre, les femmes perdent leurs maris, leurs oncles, leurs fils, leurs filles, etc.
So during wartime, women lose members of their families.
Mais aujourd'hui, avec ce que nous avons vu en Irak et en Syrie, les femmes se vendent et s'achètent.
But now we have seen in Syria and Iraq that women can be merchandised.
Et même en tant qu'analyste, il y a aujourd'hui des discours des jeunes filles que je n'entendais pas lorsque je me suis installée il y a 10 ans.
And even now, as a psychoanalyst, I can hear speeches from young girls that I could never hear 10 years ago.
Avant, les filles disaient « je veux devenir ingénieur, je veux devenir pilote, je veux faire des études ». Maintenant, les filles disent « je veux me marier ».
Before, girls used to say, I want to study, I want to be an architect, an engineer, and have a job. And now, lots of girls say, I want to get married.
And I'm very pleased to welcome Zaid Tajuddin and Gavin Bryars and to discuss the question of art, loss and creation. First of all, Zaid Tajuddin, a sculptor, but more than that, he's a polymath, really, an artist, archaeologist and a scientist. And I'm just blown away to read that he has degrees in chemistry, fine art, an MA in archaeology and a PhD in archaeological science.
Well, again, thank for the organisers to do this for us, give us the platform to talk and share our say problems or our issue or what's going on in Syria and beyond. I'm started with this because we are in Sigmund Freud Museum, and I don't know if you know, he has a massive collection of archaeological artifacts, over 2,000 of them. And on his desk, just opposite the couch, he would have, and still on display, a selection of gods and goddesses and figures, artifacts from the ancient world. Freud believes archaeology is very important, and he based his psychoanalysis on the same principle, digging in the unconscious in order to reveal and find out information and bring it back to the surface. We see as archaeologists any objects, any artifacts, so anything made by man, it's not an only object, it's a tip of an iceberg that carries a lot of information. Aleppo, you all know, important city, beautiful UNESCO World Heritage Center, considered the oldest still inhabited city in the world. Endless alleyways of beautiful streets full of trees of jasmine and honeysuckles and all that. And in between you see it's very conservative city. So high walls all made of stone, small doorways and small windows. But the soon you break the wall of this city, you enter into little networks of paradise, beautiful courtyard houses that really heavenly to be within. I never grew up in one of these houses. I was in a flat. My family gave up on those old houses ages ago. I had this kind of call to go back, and in 2004 I completed this task and I found this old house, which is again almost 400 plus years old. Most of those houses became warehouses, workshops, and been in a real estate, or became multi-occupants for refugees and migrants from the outside of Aleppo. So I bought this house, and it took me 4 years basically to take it all apart and put it back together. And the result was, for me, was my dream becoming true. Turn it into a beautiful example and bring it back to its former glory. Now, the story, war, revolution started. What started as a revolution became nasty war. So the mosque that we've seen, badly destroyed, the bazaar, big chunk of it again burned. The story of my house stopped by 2012 because no access to the city was divided, and my house became part of East Aleppo, the center. And I only could, being here, because I couldn't go to Syria, I only tried to trace and chase photos on the internet, what people post. In 2015, finally, I decided to go there. Not because of my house or anything, but because of my parents to start. My old parents, that they still live in Aleppo. And then I found out that my house became a little hospital, a field hospital, and all the cellars, the vaults became, because of the natural protection, they put 12 beds and they operate upstairs as a different praxis and operation room, which has made it a target for bombing. By the end of 2015, Aleppo liberated. There was a withdrawal of the rebels, and this was the state of my house. It was a target for the military to try to target the hospital, which has caused all the houses next to it is flattened, and somehow my house escaped it with a lot of damage still from the shelling. The 2 weeks I spent there, I was basically digging, and I never expected that, digging my own history and finding my own pictures, passports, certificates, all my books, what left of them, my artworks. So it was like trying to reconstruct my life. Next to me, there were nothing. The houses were flattened. So I was lucky in a way that I still have a piece of house remained. I did not stop. It's rebuilt. So exactly last year in May, I decided, although I'm probably not going to use this house for ages, I'm going to rebuild it and put it back the way it was. So I went there in May, June last year and started the project. I found a team and we started repairing everything. Apart from those windows that we blocked because of the looters. They're still going in and looting their houses. Apart from that, 90% the house is restored, and now my neighbor who lost his house completely live in it for free, and his children. He's my tenant and he's the guardian of the house. Now the funny story here, that what you see at the gate of the museum, it's replicas, they fakes. They made cast in cement, but still they protect them with sandbags. Ironically, the originals, most of them, they went to Berlin in a museum called Tal Haraf. And in the Second World War, was bombed. So those pieces, they became over 65,000 shards. Still, if they were in Syria, they probably never survived. The Germans spent 12 years putting huge amount of work, puzzles, all those pieces together and put them back together. But this is how they look like now. And this is how I see the Syrian future. It's just fragmented and put together. Some pieces are missing. They will never be replaced. But it's our fate. Still you see the beauty, still you see the glory, and we have to put it back. But hopefully with the same persistence, with the same energy as the German did. Despite all the divisions now between the Syrians, they would all be pleased to hear some traditional music, and they will all be wowed and enjoyed it. They will all appreciate our common traditions, our history, artifacts. So I think the hope in art, and again, as Isa was doing, leaving these little prints, things that we share, things that we appreciate, that bring us together. This is in a way our hope in this difficult time where we are trying to find separate ways. So art, I think, can play a role by bringing people together and essence, beautiful things that we share.
And then we also have Gavin Bryars, who is a composer, and very pleased to welcome you. Gavin has worked with all sorts of incredible people over the years. John Cage in the US in the late 60s. He was the founder of the Department of Music at Leicester Polytechnic, where he was professor from 1986 to 1994. And he has also a broad body of work and has collaborated with dance, visual arts and choreographers.
Active collaboration, active working together is ultimately what defines music. Music is essentially, when people ask me about, what is music? I say, well, it's not actually about sounds or noises. It's about a kind of social engagement, a social situation where people get together and they listen to each other and they respond to each other and they take note of what each other is doing and respond accordingly. And in an ideal world, they're doing this for other people. That audience is not being imposed on, they're part of this kind of network of connections. And in the real musical environment, people are working collectively with their own intelligence, which is why I tend to rule out orchestral music as really being an important genre, because most people follow a man with a stick. And in the ideal in jazz, in chamber music, in collective a cappella vocal music, there's no leader. It's rather like people used to get worried about anarchy. They say, isn't anarchy chaos? I said, no, anarchy is just the kind of order you have when there are no leaders. You simply get on with each other and do what's necessary to make sure everything works. In a way, so music can be a sort of a metaphor, or a kind of some sort of emblem of how social organisation can succeed. So I suppose I'm sneakily trying to worm my way back into the subject matter of this, of rebuilding and reconstruction of working together, finding ways of solutions and so on. And I remember, I'll just finish one story, there's one particular piece by Connie Descartes called The Great Learning, which sets 7 of the paragraphs of the Confucius classic. And one of these involves simply many people singing. And I remember a performance that we did in Portsmouth Cathedral, and I was teaching at Portsmouth Arts School. The piece simply has each word or small phrase basically translating each of the ideograms for the Chinese. So the first word would be if, and then it might be the whole, and then so on. So you start the whole process by everyone sings the word if, and it would say 8 times. We'll sing the word if on a given thing, but without any reference to pitch. So quite arbitrarily, everyone will hit this note, and they hold it. So when they repeat the note 8 times, they don't vary because they're a little bit out of tune from their neighbour. They hold it. So what starts out is this massive dissonance. It sounds like some wonderful piece of spaghetti or something. It's just this really spacey, abstract sound. But you move up through the piece by, when you come to the next word, by picking a note that you've heard somewhere nearby. So then you tune yourself to that note. And little by little, as you move through the piece, it gets more and more and more harmonious. But until by the end, you get some kind of chord, which tends to sound just like the Beach Boys, which shows the Beach Boys really are perfection. But in this particular performance in Portsmouth, there's one girl called Judy, who was what people used to call tone deaf. That is to say, she couldn't pitch accurately at all. She had no sense of pitch. And so there was always this one note, which was out with everyone else, until by the end, everyone was tuning to her. And for the first time in her entire life, she heard herself singing in tune. Now, that's a kind of a parable which can have some significance in terms of how societies can be organised, how social exchange can work, how artist collaboration can work, and how, in fact, you get somebody to get on with life. And art and life are not that separate. They both behave in similar ways.
So this discussion is entitled Reconstruction, and we're going to take a slightly different sort of geographic turn and concentrate on a project in Belgrade by Richard Deacon, which is a collaboration with the Serbian artist Brijan Bajic.
So thank you to Fedja, thank you to everybody here for inviting me. As we said, I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on in Belgrade since for 12 years now. 2006 we started. The two of us, not having worked together before, played with this like a sandpit and began to try and work out whether we could actually design a bridge between us. And we had various ideas for how this thing would work until we came up with a drawing that we liked after a considerable amount of playing. To me, this is an enormously optimistic thing, that two artists come up with something and it gradually gathers support and eventually becomes the part of the infrastructure of a city. So this wasn't nobody asked for this. We invented it. And because it was a good idea, it attracted support, and then we were lucky. like I say, Marjan has been extraordinarily energetic in promoting it. I feel enormously privileged to have been given a chance of doing something like this. As an artist, you don't often get that. You get commissions, but you don't get opportunities to say, yes, I'd like to do this, and to affect the infrastructure or the lives of a city.
And then Rory Hyde, as I mentioned, is a curator at the V&A. His title is Curator of Contemporary Architecture and Urbanism. And he's curated many shows, but his most recent one is The Future Starts Here.
This amazing model which we have in the museum now. It's a model of Aleppo. It's been made by a boy when he was 12 years old, so a couple of years ago now, Mohammed Katish. He was somehow grabbed by the urge to imagine a future of a city as it was being destroyed around him. So he begged and borrowed for art materials from friends of his family. A friend of his father gave him his workshop, which was underground, a safe place to be, where he could work in all the afternoons. And he simply assembled a huge city with Ferris wheels and towers and solar panels and helicopters and everything you can imagine. Dreaming of the future of the city once the war had ended. We heard about this project. It was profiled on Channel 4 News. A Syrian journalist had been in to meet him and to film him and to look at his models and so on. That story was picked up by a friend of mine, a curator who's in New York, Alex Kalman, who got in touch with the journalist and got in touch with Mohammed via his family, and who were all, at that stage, had left Aleppo. They were in a refugee camp in Turkey. The journalist was still there covering the war, organised for a section of the model to be taken out of the country, and which made its way to him in New York. So he presented it first in New York, which got engaged in the story and arranged for it to come to London. So we have it here in the city now. It's a small section, it's probably a metre square, but even that you can see in it the sort of incredible foresight, incredible optimism, incredible leap of imagination that it must take for somebody to think of a future when everything you know is being reduced to rubble, including your own home and your family connections and so on. You can see some recognisable parts of the city, some less recognisable. You can see solar panels, parks, bright coloured buildings, and just a sort of general, of course, a naivety, but an optimism in what he's proposing. It raised this question about who has the right to the city, or who has the authority to decide what future a city should embody over anyone else. So we've intentionally put this model next to a model by Norman Foster. It's an urban model of Masdar city. So it's simply to say, here's the biggest architect in the world, and here's the smallest architect in the world, and you decide, who has the right to the city out of these two people, who has more authority in determining what Aleppo will become. I went to a similar meeting as this, with a similar title, Rebuilding Aleppo, but instead of wonderful poets and musicians and thinkers and philosophers as we have in the room today, in this incredible setting, it was developers and NGOs and businessmen and people who are already preparing the ground for when they can bring the trucks in. And it was a terrifying meeting to be sitting in. So I'm just thrilled to be here and that this kind of conversation is happening, while of course other conversations are happening. And I would say that this model, this day, shows that neither is more real than the other, and that actually this is where the future of Aleppo ought to be determined rather than in a developer's boardroom. So, thank you.
So I'm now going to invite Darian Leader to come and join us. Darian, let me introduce you, Darian, as you come up. So Darian is a renowned psychoanalyst. He's an author, and he lectures in psychoanalysis, and he's written many books and journal articles. One of his publications is called Hands, What We Do With Them and Why, and his forthcoming title is Why Can't We Sleep?
Thanks, Vicky, and thank you to the Foundation for Art and Psychoanalysis for organising today's event. So far I've found absolutely fascinating and inspiring. The theme of the day, Rebuilding Aleppo, Memory, Loss and Creation, brings together themes that concern art and its practice, urban construction, reconstruction, psychoanalysis, and other fields as well, which hopefully we can try and show how they come together and how they're relevant here. So I'm just going to make a few remarks, really thoughts that I've had during the course of the day around those themes, rebuilding, memory, loss and creation, starting perhaps with the idea of a rebuilding. The question was posed just now, several times in fact, about when we are thinking about rebuilding Aleppo. Obviously there's the question of who is the we, and the question of appropriation and the irony, which has been pointed out by many Syrian commentators over recent years, of the fact that so much of Syria's future is being determined and discussed off-site by people who perhaps have to be in other countries, but so much of that we is circulating both inside and outside the country. When it comes then to the question of a rebuilding, you have really the whole weight of the issue. We saw earlier in Zahed's beautiful commentary about the history of his house, the building, the destruction, and the rebuilding. He compared it with the destruction during the war of all the sculptures that were then, over a period of 12 years, rebuilt almost like broken jigsaws and reconstituted. But we'd have to ask the question, what is at stake in a rebuilding? Is it a question of refinding, reassembling and recreating? Or is it about producing something absolutely different? And I was very struck by the comparison with music in the dialogue that Gavin had with Zayed. If we think of something in music like sonata form, to take a very simple example, we have the introduction of a theme at the beginning, then it's broken down into its constituent parts, which are permutated in many different ways. And then at the end of the sonata, you return to, classically, the original introductory motif, which is formally the same, it's the same thing, but because you've been through the process of breaking down and permutating and recombining all the different elements of that initial musical introduction, what you hear can never be experienced in the same way. The process of going through the sonata means that what's, in a sense, formally identical at the start and at the finish is a totally different thing, in a way perhaps as if the sculptures in Berlin, even if they were reconstituted piece by piece to make a perfect reproduction, it could never be the same because of that process and the horror and the destruction that was circumscribed by that process, the fact of the war, the bombs, the loss of life, the destruction of culture. So there's a question here, is it about rebuilding, reconstituting, creating the same, or through the process of rebuilding, creating something that, even if it seems to be the same, is absolutely different? And we could think again of the way that many artists have experimented with that kind of thinking by, let's say, rewriting Jane Austen word for word to produce a totally different book. Yeah, or remaking a work by Andy Warhol, apparently print by print, and yet at the end you've got something which is radically different, because even though it looks the same and feels the same and measures the same, it comes from a different process, a different trajectory. It comes from a different place. Gavin also brought out something very interesting here. The idea of a rebuilding, a reconstituting, implies that we have some kind of original. And obviously that idea of bringing back or returning to an original source or an original template or an original building is something that's a question not only in art but also in the Syrian conflict and other conflicts, where many of the players claim that what they're doing is reinstating a former state of affairs, bringing back the greatness of America, the glory of Damascus, the glory of the Caliphate, whatever it happens to be. Gavin pointed out that memories themselves, the original sources, can in fact be entirely fictitious, to the point that the person themselves can absolutely believe them. So the wonderful example, some of you might remember in 1980 in Reagan's election campaign in America, where he told a story about a wartime experience, and his eyes actually filled with tears as he told the story of a young gunner who'd been wounded on a bombing mission, and he couldn't bail out, and the captain of the bomber said, don't worry, we're not going to bail out without you, we're going to take the plane down. And Reagan was crying as he was telling the story, and it turned out later, the journalists did their work and found out that it was actually from a movie that had come out just after the war, and he'd incorporated this memory as his own, but not for any cynical reason, but perhaps because there was something in that story that took the place of an experience that was too painful to be remembered or even thought about by Reagan himself. And in her intervention today, Huria discussed the way in which, in her work with many refugees, she finds that the narrative doesn't fit what we might expect from a narrative, a consistency, a coherence, a clear linear trajectory. And it's interesting that the same Western countries that insist on a coherent narrative in order to gain refugee status, the police forces of those same countries, when they're investigating a rape claim, will use the coherence of narrative as, in fact, a factor arguing against the validity of the claim. The police forces in England and in France, if they find that the narrative of the experience of rape is absolutely coherent through each telling, all the details match, there are no gaps in it, it's the same the second and the third time, then they tend to think that actually this didn't happen. Yeah? And it's interesting that if the police recognise that in the same countries, the Home Office officials who are looking at claims for asylum use exactly those features for the opposite effect, as something that invalidates narrative rather than validates it. If we move then from the question of memory and rebuilding to the question of loss, again I found very moving Zahid's description of his experience of powerlessness being outside Syria and watching on TV or hearing on the radio or the news about what was happening. And he said, he felt very powerfully that he just couldn't do anything, this kind of experience of impotence. But in a way, that's not correct, because in the same breath as he articulated that, he showed us that he actually had done something, because he'd made that sculpture of a woman reclining on that sea of pencils. So representing at one level the media, information, the pain of words, of the narrative that he was hearing. Beyond the symbolic aspect of the work, there's the fact that he actually made it. And I think that this really brings us to the heart of the question of art and war. The fact that through the practice of arts, what's being shown is the fact that something can be made from the point of trauma, of horror, what can't be thought, what can't be lived, what can't be represented, that some people, not everyone, but some people can make things. And I don't know if, again, you remember, but many years ago with the Sarajevo conflict, there was a lot of press about the fact that some of the charities were spending their budgets on sending art supplies to children. And this was seen as kind of ridiculous, liberal culture, and that we should be sending medicine, painkillers, and so on. And in a way, what we've learned today shows us that the charities weren't being that stupid in what they were doing, because they recognised that, in a way, just as important as a painkiller can be the practice of showing that something can be made from the experience of loss and pain. And I think it was Richard, you said earlier that artists have a habit, if they find a broken chair, they'll mend it. I think that's disproved by your own practice, where you take broken things and you display them. Isn't that one of the functions of art? That rather than trying to mend, getting all the developers that Rory was talking about in a room with their flashy plans for a new city, artists can take broken things and give them a dignity, and showing that broken things can be a process of being made. And we might wonder whether, again, Gavin gave several examples of how musical creation can be linked to points of loss, the loss of your father, the perhaps broken romance when you were a child that you're going to re-encounter in a few days. But things are made from these points of fracture in the human history, and art shows us that things can be made from that. Like, Mohammed Katish's model. Huri and I might perhaps receive this boy in 10 years when he's a successful architect and he feels alienated and complains, why did I ever become an architect? I made this model because that was something I needed to do out of my experience of loss and tragedy, and then this massive discourse came and landed on me. I wanted to be into an architect, and I think helped me to disalienate myself. So there's the whole question of how art can show us that something can be made from an experience of loss, and it's something that works in between people. There's the famous Buddhist story of a woman whose child had died, and she's unable to register or represent or even think the loss, and walks around with the dead child's body strapped to her chest. She goes to all sorts of experts to give her help, and no one can resolve things until she meets a holy man who says, go and get some mustard seed from a house where they haven't themselves experienced the loss. So she goes around from house to house, and of course what she finds there is just story after story of bereavement and loss, until the exposure, the engagement, the dialogue with other people's stories of loss allows her to loosen the bond to her own loss and remove the body of the child. And in a way you can say that art has a similar function culturally, because it allows people, even if they can't make art themselves or don't have the opportunity or the inclination, to engage with how other people can display a broken chair, or make a broken chair, or make a chair, or whatever it happens to be. But through this public process, there's a link between a private experience and a public one, which perhaps has all its value here. Finally, just to make a point about creation and the marvellous art camp that Isa described earlier today, one of the things that struck me was the fact that the activities were all focused around rubbing. And Richard pointed out that this is a thing that's basic to childhood. It's very popular with kids. Artists might be snobbish about it in the Western world. But one of the interesting things that was, I think, came out very, very clearly from the film was the fact that in all these creations, in all these rubbings, these traces of things that maybe would be lost soon enough, they were not bounded. And there's always a crucial moment in childhood when a child moves from an interest in practices like rubbing and creating traces of things to the moment when children become interested in closing curves, a bit like the way that Donald Trump always does that with his hand. Yeah? And you realise that just as for a child, closing a curve might be crucial as a moment of being able to construct a defence against things that impinge too much, to make a boundary. Yeah. So in politics, in warfare, in religion, closing a curve, making a separation with a line, can be the difference between life and death. Richard's project of the bridge began with this engagement with the fact that this fort was separated. It wasn't easy to access because it had been built with a defensive purpose. It created a closed curve, perhaps, in itself. Just as Isa told us earlier that he was doing his art camp at a time when everyone was telling him he needed to take sides in ethnicity, in politics, in religion, in making a war between the good Americans and the bad Mexicans, between Sunni and Shiite, all the different binaries, all the different sides that a line can create. But doesn't art offer something different? Ola showed with her paintings and her discourse around the paintings, you talked about the way that you used the line as a writing that couldn't be read. You used line as a way of organising space and then as a support for colour. In other words, you showed how a line didn't necessarily have to be used to separate two peoples from each other, but rather a line could be used for a different purpose, not to separate, but to create. Thank you.